On the day of her mother's funeral, a daughter catches her father embracing his mistress and makes a shocking decision that stuns everyone. Karen has always been a young woman with a strong spirit, but a sensitive heart. Since she was a child, she learned to rely on the unwavering love of her mother, Shirley, who always made up for the emotional absence of Edward, her father, with affection and dedication. Shirley was a resilient woman who faced life's challenges with strength, never allowing pain to break her. Edward, on the other hand, was a distant man, always physically present, but cold, indifferent to emotions and family life. He fulfilled his duties as a husband and father, but without real involvement, without gestures of affection or expressions of love. Karen grew up trying to understand this coldness, seeking justifications for the lack of connection. Maybe it was just his way, maybe some people simply didn't know how to love. But no matter how much she tried to convince herself of this, a restlessness always persisted inside her, as if something was wrong that she couldn't comprehend. When Shirley fell ill, Karen took full responsibility for her mother's care. She attended every consultation, was present at every treatment session, and held her hand through all the difficult nights when the pain made rest impossible. She did everything she could to ensure that Shirley's last days were surrounded by love, offering all the affection and presence that they had always received from her. Edward, however, remained distant. He showed no despair, no sorrow. His cold behavior became even more evident to Karen, who wondered how he could watch the woman who had been by his side for so many years wither without seeming to feel anything. No matter how much she tried to ignore this growing anger, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Then, the inevitable happened. Shirley's last breath broke the silence of the house like a muffled thunder, a sound almost imperceptible, but one that destroyed everything within Karen. The air seemed to become heavy, impossible to breathe, as reality shattered before her eyes. Her mother's body was there, but her presence had disappeared, taking with it all the warmth, all the security, and the essence of home that Karen had known. Grief came like a crushing wave, overwhelming her from within, leaving a deep emptiness that was impossible to fill. The world lost its color, the sounds around her became distant, irrelevant, as if everything had been swallowed by a suffocating silence. But in the midst of despair, Karen clung to the only certainty that remained. She needed to be strong. She couldn't allow herself to fall apart. There were things to be done, responsibilities to be fulfilled. She needed to organize the funeral, receive friends and family, ensure her mother had the dignified farewell she deserved. The pain consumed her. Each beat of her heart seemed like a cruel reminder of the loss, but giving in to the suffering now was not an option. She swallowed her tears, ignored the unbearable weight on her shoulders, and moved forward, not for herself, but for Shirley. The day of the wake arrived, enveloped in a heavy, almost unreal atmosphere. Karen felt as though she were moving in a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. The room where her mother's farewell would take place was covered in white flowers, the thick, cloying scent filling the air, blending with the suffocating pain weighing on her shoulders. The coffin was in the center, surrounded by carefully arranged floral tributes, but in Karen's eyes, everything seemed blurry, out of focus, as though this wasn't her reality. Her mother was there, and yet at the same time she wasn't. People began to arrive slowly, some with hesitant steps, others holding back tears. The first hugs were painful, as if each one brought a new reminder of what had happened. She felt the arms of family and friends around her, the words of comfort murmured in her ear. She nodded, murmured automatic thanks, but inside, she felt empty. The pain was suffocating, but at the same time, it seemed distant, as if her mind refused to fully accept what was happening. At some point, she felt a firm hand touch her shoulder. "Karen." The voice was Melissa's, her mother's best friend. The woman's eyes were filled with tears, and her expression was one of genuine sadness, full of memories and longing. Karen swallowed hard, feeling a knot tighten in her throat. "She talked so much about you in the last few days," Melissa continued, squeezing Karen's hand between hers. "She said you were her greatest joy, that she was proud of the strong woman you had become." Those words pierced Karen like a blade. Her whole body tensed, and she felt the tears threatening to spill, but she remained firm. "Thank you, Melissa," she managed to say, her voice weak, almost a whisper. More hugs, more words, more faces filled with sadness passed her by. Each minute seemed to drag, each expression of condolence blending with the other, forming an indistinct blur of pain and formalities. It was then that something broke the monotony of suffering. In the midst of the ceremony, in the midst of the pain, in the midst of the weight of grief, her eyes locked onto a scene that made her stomach churn. Her father, Edward, was off to the side, in a discreet corner of the room, far from the commotion, far from the farewell to his own wife, and he wasn't alone. A woman, unfamiliar to Karen, was standing beside him. But she wasn't just some acquaintance. She wasn't merely a casual presence among those attending the wake. The way they were close, the way their hands touched, the way their gazes crossed with complicity. Karen froze. Her heart began to pound faster, not from emotion or sadness, but from something that burned inside her with overwhelming intensity. The woman leaned in closer to him, whispering something in his ear. Edward, instead of pulling away, stayed there, allowing the closeness, accepting that gesture with ease. And then, to Karen's absolute shock, he embraced her. But it wasn't a comforting hug. It wasn't a gesture of solace between two acquaintances sharing common grief. It was an intimate embrace, too close, too long. Karen felt her blood boil. How could he? How dare he, on the day of his wife's funeral, be there in the arms of another woman? She felt her fists clench. Her eyes burned in a way that wasn't just from the tears she was holding back, but from the fury rising in her throat like a scream waiting to escape. The grief that had dominated every part of her being until that moment was swallowed by a far stronger feeling: rage. The anger grew quickly, uncontrollably, transforming into an overwhelming impulse. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to march up to him, to demand answers, to expose him right there in front of everyone. But then she took a deep breath. No, not here. Her mother's funeral wasn't the time for that. That day was about Shirley, not about Edward and his blatant betrayal. If she exploded there, if she caused a scene in that moment, she wouldn't be honoring her mother. She'd just be turning that sacred farewell into a shameful spectacle. With effort, she turned away, but the knot in her throat didn't disappear. The weight of that scene was embedded in her like an open wound. When the wake ended and people began to leave, Karen felt that her mind couldn't rest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the scene again. The way Edward held that woman, how the two exchanged looks. Maybe she was just a friend, someone offering comfort. But what if she wasn't? What if that woman was more than that? The next morning, Karen woke with a heavy head, as though she hadn't really slept. The exhaustion from the grief consumed her, but it wasn't just that. The weight of the scene she had witnessed at the wake was still stuck in her mind, repeating itself endlessly. She closed her eyes and saw her father in the arms of that woman. She saw their hands touching, the way they looked at each other with complicity. She felt the rage again, the suffocating knot in her throat. Maybe she was just a friend, someone trying to offer comfort, an acquaintance who had come closer to give support in a difficult time. But the way they were together didn't seem like a gesture of solidarity. There was something there, something that went beyond mere comfort. Karen wanted to believe she was exaggerating, that her pain was making her see things where there was nothing. But what if it wasn't? What if that woman was more than just an acquaintance? The doubt ate at her like a slow poison. Karen knew she couldn't face this alone. The weight of the doubt, the constant knot in her throat, the suffocating feeling that something greater was hidden beneath the surface. All of that was eating at her, making it impossible to even attempt to move forward. She needed to talk to someone who not only listened, but could help her understand. Without thinking much, she picked up the phone and dialed Pamela's number. Her most loyal friend, the one person who had always been by her side, no matter the situation. "Pamela," she said as soon as the call was answered, her voice filled with tension. "Karen," Pamela responded immediately, sensing the concern in her friend's tone. "What's wrong?" "I need to talk to you. Now." There was a brief pause before the response. "Come to my house. I'm waiting for you." Less than half an hour later, Karen was sitting on Pamela's living room sofa, her hands cold and restless on her lap. The weight of what she had to say seemed heavier now, as though by putting it into words, it became more real. Pamela, sitting across from her, kept her gaze fixed on her, her expression filled with concern. "Yesterday was my mom's wake," Karen started, her voice quiet but firm. Pamela nodded immediately. "I know, I was there, Karen. I saw how hard it was for you." "Yes," Karen took a deep breath, "but it wasn't just that." Pamela furrowed her brow. "What do you mean?" Karen pressed her hands against her knees, trying to control the tension coursing through her body. "I saw my dad with a woman." Pamela blinked, confused. "What do you mean, a woman?" "He was off to the side in the corner of the room. I saw him from a distance, and he wasn't alone." Her friend leaned forward, trying to absorb Karen's words more carefully. "Who was she?" "I don't know. I've never seen her before, but the way they were—" "Pamela," he hugged her. Pamela paused for a moment before responding. "Maybe he was just receiving comfort." It wasn't that kind of hug. Karen shook her head, feeling the anger rise again. It wasn't a mourning hug. It wasn't a comforting hug. It wasn't the hug of someone who lost their wife the day before. It was something more. The way he held her hand, the way they looked at each other, I felt it immediately. It was intimate. Pamela stayed silent for a few moments, her face becoming more serious. "Are you sure about what you saw?" "I wish I could say no," Karen replied, her voice filled with frustration. "I wish I could say I'm seeing things, that my mind is distorting everything because of the pain. But I can't ignore it. That didn't seem normal to me, Pamela. Not for a man who should be mourning his wife." Pamela crossed her arms, her gaze turning more serious, as if pondering every possibility. "Do you think this woman has been part of your dad's life before your mum passed?" The question hung in the air like a sharp knife. Karen felt a chill run through her body. The idea that Edward might have been involved with another woman while Shirley was still alive wasn't just revolting, it was cruel. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice hesitant but filled with anguish. "But what if he was? What if he was cheating for years? What if this woman had always been there and I never noticed? And worse..." Karen closed her eyes for a moment, gathering the strength to say what was tormenting her most. "What if my mom knew? What if she died carrying this burden without ever saying anything?" The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. Pamela didn't answer immediately, but Karen could see the shift in her expression. That possibility was too devastating to ignore. Pamela sighed heavily. "That's a lot to process, Karen, but before we jump to any conclusions, we need to be sure." "How?" Karen asked, her voice filled with determination. "I can't just forget what I saw. I need to find out the truth." Pamela watched her for a long moment, as though weighing every detail of what they had just discussed. Then she took a deep breath and responded firmly. "Then we need to find out the truth." Karen furrowed her brow, feeling the urgency building within her. "But how? How are we going to do that?" Pamela leaned forward, her eyes sharp and filled with determination. "We'll investigate. We'll watch his steps. We'll find out if this woman really has been in his life longer than she should have." Karen's heart began to race. "You're telling me to follow my dad?" "Exactly," Pamela confirmed. "But not just that. We'll look for patterns in his behavior, understand his habits. If he has something to hide, sooner or later, he'll leave traces." Karen hesitated for a moment. "And if we don't find anything? If it's all in my head?" Pamela shook her head. "If it is, great. You can move on knowing there's nothing hidden. But if we discover something, at least you'll know the truth, and you won't live with what-ifs for the rest of your life." Karen took a deep breath, feeling the weight of uncertainty pressing on her shoulders. But deep down, she already knew the answer. Over the next few weeks, Karen and Pamela dove into an obsessive investigation of Edward. At first, it seemed like a labyrinth with no exit. The man was always reserved, discreet, but little by little, the pieces began to fit together. Karen scoured old bank records, analyzing her father's spending patterns. There were transactions that made no sense, sums withdrawn without explanation, payments to places that didn't match anything familiar. Meanwhile, Pamela discreetly followed him, observing his schedule, his routines, the places he went after work. "He's been to an expensive restaurant twice this week," Pamela said one evening, sitting at Karen's kitchen table with a notebook in front of her. "With who?" Karen asked immediately. "I couldn't see clearly, but it didn't seem like a business dinner." The discoveries came in fragments, small details that accumulated and started forming a disturbing picture. But nothing was solid enough yet. Karen felt consumed by uncertainty, by the need for answers. With every new suspicious detail she found, the anger inside her grew. But more was needed, more proof, more truths, until she had an idea. "Melissa," she said suddenly. Pamela looked up from her notebook, absorbing Karen's suggestion. "Melissa," she repeated, leaning forward slightly. "That's a good idea. If anyone knows anything, it's her. She and your mom were inseparable. If your mom found out anything about your dad, Melissa might have been the only person she talked to." Karen didn't hesitate. "I'm going to her house right now." Pamela nodded, leaning back in her chair. "Good, but take it easy. If she knows something, it might be hard for her to talk. And if your mom really trusted that secret with her, she might hesitate to reveal it." "I know," Karen said, taking a deep breath. "But I need to know the truth." A short time later, Karen stopped the car in front of Melissa's house. Her heart was pounding in her chest, a mix of anxiety and fear weighing in her stomach. Melissa had always been part of her life, always been there during important moments. But now, this visit wasn't about happy memories or casual conversations. It was about something much bigger. She stood still in front of the door for a few seconds, gathering courage before raising her hand and knocking. A few moments later, the door opened, revealing Melissa. The woman stared at her with surprise and concern, as if she knew something was wrong before Karen even said a word. "Karen?" Her voice was soft, but attentive. "Hi, Melissa," Karen replied, trying to force a smile but failing miserably. Melissa's eyes analyzed her face, and her expression softened. "Come in, dear." Karen stepped inside and felt the familiar scent of chamomile tea that Melissa always made. Everything felt cozy, but in that moment, the warmth of the house seemed unable to ease the tension inside her. "Want some tea?" Melissa asked, walking toward the kitchen. "No, thanks," Karen replied quickly. I need to ask you something." Melissa stopped halfway and turned to face her. Her eyes carried a mix of apprehension and understanding, as though she already knew what was coming. "What about?" Karen took a deep breath before speaking. My dad. There was a brief silence. Melissa returned to the couch, sitting across from Karen, her hands resting on her knees. What exactly do you want to know? She asked, with an almost rehearsed calmness. Karen moistened her lips, feeling her throat dry. I think he was cheating on my mom. Melissa blinked slowly, but she didn't seem surprised. She just kept her gaze fixed on Karen, as though waiting for her to continue. And I think my mom knew, Karen finished, her voice quieter now. Melissa's expression changed. Her face tightened slightly, and she averted her gaze for a moment, as if searching for the best way to respond. Karen felt her stomach twist. Melissa. She knew, didn't she? Melissa sighed deeply, her shoulders slumping a bit. Then she finally spoke. She knew. It was as if the ground had disappeared beneath Karen's feet. Her body went tense, her breath caught in her throat. She blinked a few times, trying to process that single word. What? Her voice came out almost in a whisper. Melissa looked at her with sadness in her eyes. Your mom found out years ago. She came to me, told me she had found proof. She knew about the other woman. Karen's heart was beating so loudly she could hear her blood rushing in her ears. And she never told me? Melissa shook her head slowly. Because she chose not to do anything. The indignation rose within Karen. Why? How could she know and just... She didn't do it out of weakness, Karen, Melissa interrupted gently. She did it for you. For the family. She knew that this truth would destroy everything, and she didn't want you to carry that burden. Karen felt her breath falter. Her mother knew. She knew she was being cheated on. She knew about that woman. And still, she carried this burden alone. She died with that secret, never allowing herself to share her pain. She knew, Karen repeated, almost in disbelief. Melissa nodded, her expression filled with pain. And she suffered, Karen. But she never wanted you to suffer with her. Karen closed her eyes, feeling the avalanche of emotions threatening to crush her. Everything inside her burned. It wasn't just sadness. It wasn't just indignation. It was a growing hatred, a revolt that made her blood boil. Now it wasn't just about Edward and his mistress. It was about her mother, about the years of silence, about the injustice of a lifetime sacrificed. And that, Karen would never forgive. Karen took a deep breath, trying to absorb everything Melissa had told her. She stood up, her legs slightly trembling, but her gaze was firm. Thank you, Melissa, she said, her voice sounding more controlled than she expected. Melissa held her hands for a moment, squeezing them gently. I know this isn't easy, Karen, but your mom always wanted to protect you. Whatever you decide to do now, don't let this pain consume who you are. Karen nodded, but deep inside she already knew it wasn't just pain, it was a purpose. She left Melissa's house without looking back and drove straight to Pamela's house. When she entered, her friend immediately noticed that something had changed. You found something out, Pamela stated, crossing her arms and analyzing Karen carefully. Karen nodded. My mum knew. Pamela's eyes widened. What? Melissa told me everything. My mum found out about the affair years ago. She found proof, knew about the other woman, and never said a word. She chose to stay silent. Pamela sat down slowly, absorbing that information. She just accepted it? She did it for me, Karen replied, the anger rising in her voice. To protect the family, so I wouldn't carry that burden. And she died carrying it alone. The silence filled the space between them. Pamela knew what that revelation meant. I want him to pay, Karen said finally. Her voice was firm, without hesitation. Pamela stared at her for a moment and then nodded. Then let's plan this right. The two sat at the table, and Pamela opened a notebook, turning to a blank page. "First, we need to hit him where it hurts the most," Pamela began. "He has this woman, right? Let's make her doubt him." Karen crossed her arms, thinking, "If he lied to my mom for years, he might be lying to this woman too." "Exactly. We create a fake profile and start planting seeds of doubt," Pamela suggested. "We imply that he has other lovers, that he's not faithful to her. If she starts questioning him, he'll get tangled up in his lies," Karen agreed. "Great. But that's just the start," Pamela continued. "His reputation is everything to him. If we can get proof of the affair and any other financial dirt, we can tear down the image he's built." Karen nodded, determined. "Let's find everything we can." In the following days, Karen created a fake profile and began infiltrating the online life of Edward's mistress. She sent anonymous messages, insinuating infidelities, suggesting that Edward wasn't who she thought he was. Slowly, the woman began to respond, showing signs of insecurity. "She's already suspicious," Karen said to Pamela, watching the message exchange. "Keep going. Plant more doubt," Pamela encouraged. And it worked. Within days, the relationship started to fall apart. The mistress constantly questioned Edward, made demands, pressured for answers. Edward, used to controlling everything, became flustered. His lies began to contradict themselves. But that was just the beginning. Karen then focused her attention on her father's reputation. She scoured records, found compromising documents, and analyzed suspicious financial transactions. She discovered that Edward had embezzled money from her mother's inheritance to support his double life. "This is what we need," she said to Pamela, holding the documents in her hands. They gathered everything into a detailed dossier, proof of the affair, of the financial theft, of suspicious transactions. They attached photos, screenshots of messages. Then, Karen sent everything anonymously to the company's partners, influential clients, and people in Edward's circle. The impact was immediate. The scandal exploded. Edward was called to emergency meetings. The company, concerned about its image, began questioning his position. The looks on him changed. Comments circulated in the halls. Edward's mask began to crack, and Karen wasn't done yet. With the financial proof in hand, she filed a lawsuit alleging the wrongful appropriation of marital assets. Even though justice was slow, the mere opening of the case already brought devastating consequences. Lawyers got involved, investigations started, and the public exposure increased even more. Edward quickly began to lose credibility. Contracts were cancelled, partnerships dissolved, friends, once so loyal, started to disappear. The mistress, tired of the doubts and lies, left him. The company, with no way out, discreetly distanced itself from him. Everything he had built started to crumble. Karen didn't need to see him suffer to know she had won. But still, she went to his house one last time. When Edward opened the door, the man before her was no longer the one she had known. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes dull, his expression marked by despair. For the first time, he seemed to understand the weight of what he had done. "Karen." His voice was weak, as if he didn't know what to say. She looked at him for a few seconds, allowing him to feel the crushing silence between them, but she didn't say a word. She simply turned and left. That day, Edward lost everything, and Karen, finally, moved on. Her mother rested in peace. Justice, though late, was finally done. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.